Good afternoon, grade 8s. I hope you are managing with all the work that we have done up until now, and I hope that you are learning the work as we go along, because I'm making sure that I don't make your lessons too long, and that means that my expectation of you is that you learn the work. That's your homework every day. Okay, right. So let's have a look. Last lesson, last week Friday, I spoke about what happens if a female does conceive, in other words, the egg is fertilized, and what happens if the female doesn't conceive, in other words, the egg is not fertilized. So I'm going back a few slides just to make sure that you remember this process. So remember that the ovary produces one egg cell per month in a human female. As between the time of puberty and the time of menopause, when she stops menstruating. That little egg cell is pulled into the fallopian tube, and it moves down the fallopian tube. And remember, it doesn't move of its own accord. It's not like a sperm, it can't swim. It is moved down the fallopian tube by the cilia on the cells lining the fallopian tube, wafting and moving the egg cell down the fallopian tube. So remember, I said to you that the egg cell may be fertilized depending on whether sexual intercourse without the use, say, of a condom has occurred within a reasonable period of time of ovulation or not. So if it is fertilized, remember, the cell that is produced is called a zygote. That cell has chromosomes and genes from both the father and the mother. And remember that that zygote then divides. And as soon as it divides the first time, it's not called a zygote anymore, it's called an embryo. And it is moved down the fallopian tube, and it carries on dividing as it is going. Once it has reached the uterus, that little ball of cells has arranged itself into a little hollow ball of cells called the blastocyst, and that embeds itself in the endometrium of the uterus. The process of embedding is called implantation. And from then on, the female is pregnant, and, well, some people consider pregnancy as being here, starting from there, and some people consider pregnancy as starting from this stage of the game. So from now on, she is gestating the baby. In other words, that little embryo is busy developing in the uterus. Remember that if the egg cell is not fertilized, it continues to move down the fallopian tube, and it's disintegrating and deteriorating as it goes. And so by the time it's reached this stage of the fallopian tube, in theory, it shouldn't even be able to be fertilized. Okay, so we did that. So let's talk now about gestation. So gestation is the period of pregnancy. And I'm sure you know this word because you know, for example, that an elephant's gestation period is 22 months. So you know that an elephant is pregnant for 22 months. So following implantation, some of the cells of the embryo develop into a placenta, which links the embryo, which is linked to the embryo and to the mother's blood supply via the umbilical cord. Now, we must just mention a few things about the placenta just now. So the embryo, and later on the fetus, gains nourishment. In other words, it gets its food substances and passes its waste substances through the umbilical cord and through the placenta. Okay, so let's have a look here. This is the uterus wall, okay, of the mother, and this structure here is the placenta. It's the place where the embryo is attached to the mother's uterus. And connecting the embryo to the placenta is the umbilical cord. And please be careful how you spell umbilical cord. Look up at the notes. C-O-R-D. There's no H there. It's not a musical cord. It's a cord as in an electrical cord. There's no H in it. Okay, so let's go back down to the drawing. Okay, so the umbilical cord connects at one end to the belly button, the navel of the embryo or fetus, and at the other end it connects to the placenta. Okay, and there are blood vessels that run from the baby to the placenta through the center of the umbilical cord. So really, if you consider the electrical cord that connects your laptop to the wall, the umbilical cord is like the whole structure, and there's an insulating layer, normally black plastic, around the outside, but inside there are important wires. So inside the umbilical cord there are important blood vessels. So let's have a look at this end here. If you look on the drawing, this has been magnified here so that you can see it in more detail. So this is the umbilical cord, and here are the blood vessels of the embryo that run to and from the umbilical cord. Now, it's terribly important, despite the fact that the embryo gets nutrients from the mother and passes waste substances to the mother through the placenta, there must be no mixing of actual blood at the placenta. So I'm sure you know, for example, a person can't just get a blood transfusion from any old person, any person at all. So let's say, for example, a person with blood group A negative is injured and loses a lot of blood and needs to have a transfusion from somebody who has donated blood. They can't just have anybody's blood. They can't have B positive, for example. It's got to be a very specific type of blood that is transfused into them, otherwise they could die. Now, a baby, an embryo, doesn't necessarily have the same blood group as the mother, because blood groups are determined genetically. And depending on who the father is and depending on the mother's genetics for blood group, the embryo and the mother may have different blood groups. So the two bloods cannot mix with each other. So there is a membrane, and I'm going to show you on the actual drawing with the mouse. There's a membrane which separates embryonic tissue on the left from maternal tissue on the right. So placenta is in fact made up of both embryonic and maternal tissue. But that membrane, although it allows certain substances to pass over it in either direction, it keeps the two bloods from mixing. Okay, so what does the embryo get from the mother across the placenta? So if you look at the text again, nutrients such as glucose, amino acids, fats, etc. That's nutrients. Oxygen and antibodies are able to move from the maternal blood. Look at the diagram on the right side. They're able to diffuse from the maternal blood across the membrane and get into the embryonic or fetal blood and pass down the umbilical cord and then pass into the baby. Reverse route, carbon dioxide and nitrogen containing wastes that are normally excreted in urine, like urea and uric acid, are able to pass down the umbilical cord in the blood vessel, and when they reach the placenta, they will diffuse from the embryonic tissue or fetal tissue into the maternal blood, and in fact will pass out with the mother's waste substances. So when she breathes out carbon dioxide in the air, then some of that carbon dioxide actually came from the baby. When she urinates nitrogenous waste substances, some of those nitrogenous waste substances actually come from the embryo. Okay, let's talk about antibodies. So you remember that, I hope you know that antibodies are tiny proteins made by a person if they have a disease, get a disease, experience a disease. So let's say, for example, that this year I get flu, and I'm sick from flu. I will get better because my body will make antibodies against flu. Now, it is possible for some of those antibodies to pass from maternal blood into the embryonic tissue of the placenta and pass into the baby, and that's quite important because it helps to protect the baby against certain diseases once it is born. The embryo, I shouldn't be calling it a baby. Okay, so let's go. Here is a picture of a photograph of an actual human embryo at 6 weeks. And so you can see that it's already quite well developed. You can even see little ribs here. So it's got fingers, it's got a little pinna, in other words, the ear part. Look at the umbilical cord. You can even see blood vessels within the skull. And there's the busy developing eye. Okay, so this shows the uterus of a mother with this part of it being the endometrium. And so what you can see is the little developing embryo actually right inside the endometrium. Okay, it's still an embryo because it's less than 8 weeks old. And you can see the little sac around the outside. We'll talk a little bit about the sac just now. And you can see the umbilical cord, and this would be the placenta, where the umbilical cord is connected to the endometrium of the mother. Okay, so here's a little baby that's already been born. It has been born by a Caesar because it is still connected to the placenta. So this whole structure is the placenta. There's the umbilical cord, and you can see how the umbilical cord is actually connected to the baby's belly button or navel. Okay. If the baby was born by a delivery, a natural birth, then what would happen is the placenta stays inside the mother for about 20 minutes after the birth of the baby. So this would still be inside the uterus, just like an electrical plug is connected to the wall. This would be the electrical cord equivalent. And then this is your laptop at the other end of the electrical cord. Now, when the baby passes out of the mother, then what they do is they clamp the umbilical cord in 2 places close to each other, and they make a little cut between it. So for a little while, the baby has a little stump of an umbilical cord remaining. And that little stump of umbilical cord becomes like a scab, because that's what it is. It's got a whole lot of blood inside it. And after a short while, a number of days, it just falls off and it leaves a little scar there, and said scar is the belly button. Okay. Anyway, so the placenta has to pass out of the mother, passes out a little bit later together with the remains of the umbilical cord. Okay. So you are to complete the activity on page 81 of the textbook. Okay. And I will put the memo of that up for you to check probably next week, Friday. Let me just make a note of that while going is good. Otherwise I'll forget to do that. Okay. All right. Then the next little thing that you have to learn about is something called a flow diagram. And a flow diagram shows a process normally that consists of a number of steps or a number of stages. Okay. And you're going to, next week, on Friday, you're going to do a flow diagram. But first of all, let me tell you about the rules of doing a flow diagram. Just like everything else in life sciences, there are a number of different rules that apply here. So what are you going to do? You must start a new page. You give the diagram a complete heading because it's a diagram. Okay. And what you're going to do is you're going to use words or short phrases only, not entire sentences, to describe each step of the process. So it would be like this. So here's a heading. These are all the steps in the process of the scientific process, doing an investigation. Okay, and what you can see is the steps. There's a step and an arrow down, a step and an arrow down, step and an arrow down. And these steps are not written as full sentences. They're written either as separate as one word or a short phrase. So they never start with the or a. So here, for example, make observations, identify a problem, formulate a hypothesis. It always goes down. It never snakes across the page. And they're never in life sciences funny little boxes or little clouds. Okay, life is too short. So start a new page, give the diagram a complete heading, use words or short phrases only to describe each step of the process in a particular sequence. You work down the page and you use arrows going down to join each step. You never use boxes and you never use clouds. Okay, so make sure that you know how to do a flow diagram. We'll go back to that flow diagram. I'll give it to you for homework on Friday. Oh, grade 8's been cut off my sheet of processes. Okay, all right. So let's carry on with gestation. So the embryo that is implanted in the endometrium continues to divide. Inside the embryo, this is bad English. The embryo is enclosed in a membrane called the amnion, which encloses the embryo in a fluid-filled chamber. That's appallingly bad English. I apologize. Doesn't matter how many times I read these things after I've done them. They always look perfect until I need to give you a lesson. And the fluid is called amniotic fluid. And basically what this says to you is the embryo is inside a sac called the amnion, which is a membrane. And the amnion encloses fluid called amniotic fluid. So let's see if I've got a picture of them. Got a beautiful picture. So here's a little developing embryo between 7 and 8 weeks. And you can see that it is completely surrounded by a membrane. And that membrane is the amnion. And inside the amnion is a fluid called amniotic fluid. And the amniotic fluid is terribly, terribly, terribly important. Okay. It's got lots of functions. It protects the baby from mechanical damage. It helps to keep the baby warm and prevents it from drying out. Okay. And then the cord is joined to the middle of the baby's abdomen on the ventral surface, in other words, to the navel or to the belly button. And when the baby is born, the umbilical cord is cut. And the place where this cord attached is called the belly button or navel. So the average length of human gestation, which is the process or period of developing inside the uterus, in other words, between the time of conception and the time of birth, is 280 days or 40 weeks. And it's counted from the first day of the woman's last menstrual period. And during this time, the embryo, later called the fetus, is enclosed in a fluid-filled sac. So enclosed in the amnion, enclosed in the amniotic sac. Okay. And here you can see also, there's the umbilical cord. And what you can see clearly in that umbilical cord is the blood vessels. So the blood vessels, some of which transport blood, it carries a high percentage of carbon dioxide and waste substances from the embryo to the placenta, and some of which carries blood from the placenta back to the embryo, and that blood contains a high percentage of oxygen and also nutrients, and then also antibodies, very important. Okay, so there you've got 50-day-old embryo. There you've got a little bit older. You can see the umbilical cord very clearly. And in both of these, you can see the amniotic sac very, very clearly. So this is a baby that is ready to be born. And you know that it's ready to be born, firstly, because it's big. And secondly, because it has turned so that its head is facing downwards. And that's very important, because if the head isn't facing downwards, then it's very difficult for the fetus to actually get through the vaginal canal, because it'll have little pieces sticking up. Now, if you think about it, and you think about swimming forwards through water, the body is streamlined. In other words, this is a narrow part, and then it gets a little bit wider, and then there are the legs. And you can't have a baby trying to be given birth to if it was the other way around. If the head was up here and the two legs were down there, because one leg would get stuck over here and the other leg would get stuck over here, and it's not going to slip out easily. It doesn't slip out easily at the best of times, but certainly if it is not head down, it doesn't pass out with ease. And then in this case, the placenta is up the top here. Now the placenta can be anywhere. It can be at the top, it can be at the side or that side, or the front or the back of the uterus. What you can also see really nicely in this slide is how big the uterus has swollen to. So remember, the uterus was tiny. It was about 7 centimeters long down here. Remember, there's the one hip bone and the other, and I showed you the uterus actually doesn't even go up under normal circumstances as high as the 2 hip bones. And here it is, it's extended right up here. So there we go. Okay, so here the placenta is at the top, the back of the umbilical, of the embryo, uterus. Let's get this right. And here is the single blood vessel returning from the placenta. It's colored red because the blood is very oxygenated in it. And it's coming from the placenta, and there's only one of these. It's called the umbilical vein, and it is transporting blood high in oxygen, nutrients, hormones, and umbilical cord, antibodies carrying it back to the embryo. And then 2 little smaller blood vessels, the umbilical arteries, transport deoxygenated blood, so containing waste such as carbon dioxide and nitrogenous wastes, from the embryo to the placenta so that the mother can pass those out. Okay. Right, that's enough for today. Okay, so learn the rules of doing a flow diagram. Mark your question from last week. Make sure that you've learned your work so that you're ready for an assessment at any time. And we'll start here again on Friday.